Hello and welcome to another movie review here on HSG, and this particular flick kind of shares some similarities with a movie that I reviewed within the last couple of weeks as well that I absolutely adored, and that is The Fury of a Patient Man. Also a Spanish revenge thriller that I watched on Netflix, likewise with this one. Now this movie also has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, but it doesn't have that many scores, so take that as you will. I chose to review this movie because despite the fact that it has some apparent similarities to The Fury of a Patient Man, it is at the same time a very different movie. This, in fact, is actually a much darker movie than that one. It's much more somber, it's slower, which may sound amazing if you've seen that movie, because that isn't exactly fast-paced, and this movie doesn't necessarily give you what you want from this kind of genre. And that's not really a spoiler, I think that's just something that you need to know. Because there are certain movies which don't necessarily have the ending that you expect or even want, and that can still work. Of course, I often bring up The Thing because that ends in a way that isn't traditional Hollywood, but even something like 7 Days of Retaliation, that I also mentioned in that review. That movie has a story which doesn't go to places that you would expect it to. It's not your typical I spit on your grave kind of story where it's relatively straightforward. Some of these are, especially in more recent years, a bit grittier, a bit more complex, and not necessarily as satisfying as most revenge movies are. It's kind of a prerequisite of the genre, and yet they buck that trend. And I think that if you do it well, that can actually work. It makes it into more of a higher tier thriller rather than just a revenge gore fest, which is what some of them definitely lean toward. Now, this movie revolves around a surgeon. He's a slightly older gentleman. It is a Spanish movie, as I said as well. He's got a wife, a son, and a daughter. His son and daughter are both in their later teens, and his son is attacked and left for dead outside of a nightclub. And he goes about trying to find out who is responsible, why they did it, and to try and deal with them. But of course, the fact that he's an older guy, and the fact that he's a surgeon, puts an interesting twist on the scenario. Now, in a traditional Western movie, America in particular, this would still be relatively straightforward. The fact that he's a surgeon would be juicy to a producer because you can, make his expertise turn him into some kind of senior citizen equivalent of John Wick, slicing and dicing people and knowing exactly what artery to cut and what vein to prick. This isn't that kind of movie. This is not an action thriller. This is a very, very slow burn, and it's actually more of a drama than it is a thriller. It's more about the family. It's more about his struggle with himself as a father. What should he do? But also emotionally and even physically, what can he do? Is he confident enough? Is he brave enough to do what needs to be done? Is he even capable of doing what needs to be done to not just hurt people necessarily, but even just to find the people who are involved? Movies always present finding those responsible as a very simple thing. The majority of this movie revolves around finding who is responsible, not necessarily just getting the revenge. That is a refreshing change, because it gives the movie this more air of realism. It makes it feel every bit as frustrating as you would actually be. And even though I'm not a parent, I can certainly appreciate aspects of the movie which are put over well enough so that somebody who isn't even a parent can still feel that kind of frustration that the character has. You can definitely put yourself in his shoes, and I found this movie, despite being in concept similar to The Fury of a Patient Man and even Blue Ruin and some others like that, this one actually kind of emotionally affected me more. Not in terms of like being weepy or something, but actual anger in the story. This movie is relentlessly oppressing to the main guy. And he's no angel. But you can understand where he's coming from, of course, as a father. This is a father's story. This is more so, in fact, about a father's emotional journey than it is a revenge movie. So even though it's technically within that genre, it's, as I said, much more of a drama thriller and then a revenge flick after. You could also almost call it a crime thriller to some degree, because it is, as I said, more about the tracking down than the actual carrying out. Plus, it introduces this interesting dynamic, which actually does a great job in the film, where these revenge characters Fury of a Patient Man, even something as westernized as a John Wick or Equalizer, Jack Reacher, all these kind of ones, they're always a guy who's kind of like ready to do whatever needs to be done. And although that is what many of us want to see, that's kind of the catharsis and the fun factor of getting revenge, not everyone's like that. So what if you have a character who is not the most confident person? And that portrayal of his character in this movie actually reminded me more so of something like Blue Ruin. If you've seen Blue Ruin, I think you might enjoy this one, and vice versa. If you've checked this one out, then be sure to stick around on the channel for my review of Blue Ruin even, or just check it out yourself, because they do have a fair amount of similarities. They're both much more somber, they're darker. This movie is very dark, in fact, and in terms of filmmaking, the cinematography, soundtrack, even something as simple as how long scenes are allowed to sit for, and how long continuous shots in this movie are done. I read a couple of the brief reviews that viewers put down for this film, and one of them in particular pointed out how they found the shots just took too long. You could have made this movie 10 minutes long instead. I think that's ridiculous. It's clearly somebody who doesn't appreciate decent filmmaking or has ADHD or something, because the movie is not just padding the runtime. I completely understand what the filmmaker was going for. And although, actually, somewhat ironically, when I write a book, I actually don't put any filler at all in there. Everything that I write is what needs to be in the story, and yet in a movie, I can fully appreciate when you just let a character sit for a moment. Even something as recent as Joker, for example. You're allowed to sit with Arthur sometimes and just take in the moment. This movie does a similar thing with this character. There are scenes where a character will be pushing their way through a nightclub, and it's shot in real time. Usually you would make a ton of cuts in that scene, bumping shoulders with people, changing the camera angle, keeping it interesting, and the whole process of walking through the crowd would take maybe 20 seconds at the most. In this movie, the shot of this character walking through a nightclub as the music is pounding in the background, it's allowed to play out for what seems to be like 2 minutes, at least, completely uncut. It becomes uncomfortable. But this is the crucial thing. That's good. I like the fact that shots last long enough to become uncomfortable. Shots in this movie are actually allowed to play out to the point where you notice that the shot is still going on. Because in most movies, unless you're a film buff, average audiences, they probably don't even notice a one take or a long shot. They just watch a movie and enjoy it. For a filmmaker, you notice those kind of things because you appreciate them. This movie allows shots to go on for so long that even an average moviegoer will start to notice, hang on a second, this shot is going for a long time. Uncomfortably long. And it happens probably 5 or 6 times at least throughout the movie that stand out a lot. There's a scene, as I said, in a nightclub. There's a scene where a character is just sitting in a car with people outside the car taunting them. That is allowed to go uncomfortably long as well. And possibly my favourite scene in the entire movie is when there are 2 characters sitting in a car and an exchange is made. And I'm going to get into that more specifically in the spoiler portion, because there are a couple of exchanges like that, but I mean one in particular which is pretty intense, and yet very little is said, and it's a fantastic one-shot scene. It's allowed to play out, and it actually reminded me of like British horror, or British gang flicks, like that hard-edged London cinema. That I loved in this movie as well. I will say, if you're looking for catharsis, don't watch this movie. It's not that kind of revenge flick. This is much more the kind of movie that you should watch if you like almost wallowing in the melancholy and just getting lost in feelings of anger and injustice and how screwed up the system is and how oppressive people and life can be. This is that kind of movie. It's about as close to depressing as you could be without me actually finding it depressing. I really like this film. But I will say, I don't know if I ever need to see it again. Now, I'm going to leave it there for the non-spoiler talk. So if what I just said sounds like it would appeal to you, then I would urge you to check this film out, either on Netflix or find it where you can. But in terms of spoiler talk, I'm going to allow you a couple of seconds just to leave and pause the video if you want to, but let's get into it. Of course, the scene in the car that I'm referring to is when the owner of the nightclub, who has such a wonderfully sleazy moment in the hospital. There are so many beautifully horrible character moments in this movie, which I adored. When he comes to visit the father and give him the flowers, I was actually impressed, first of all, that the guy had come. He seemed sincere. And then comes the line about publicity, because it had to come. And I thought, of course. Of course, because that is exactly what a character like that would be. I thought that for the majority of this film, the father dealt with everything very admirably. Was he a coward? No, I don't think so. Some people would call him a coward because he didn't get the revenge for his son himself. I don't think he was a coward. I think it's actually the exact opposite. See, there's something, and I've discussed this with friends in personal life as well, there's something which can be a fine line between being a coward and what I believe the character in this movie is. There's a huge difference, but it's not easily perceptible. Only you yourself know the difference, really, where you can either be a coward or, crucially, you can know your limitations. And those are two very different things which unfortunately can come across as very similar. One is in effect cowardice, the other is modesty. And people don't think of that very much. If, for instance, somebody tells you to jump off of the Empire State Building to prove that you can fly, saying no doesn't make you a coward. It means you know your limitations. You can't fly. That doesn't make you a coward. And yet the result seems the same. You say, no, I'm not doing that. See what I mean? In this movie, when the father initially doesn't want to go after the perpetrators himself, the guy who he pays to do it, who kind of just disappeared from the movie, so I'm assuming that that father of the kid who smashes his hand with the hammer, which was what I was talking about, my favourite scene from the movie, I'm assuming that he either beat or killed that guy, because he got in the car with the money, and I wouldn't have thought that guy would have given the money up. So that's kind of ambiguous. I sort of like that. But that moment when he calls the father a coward, I can understand why he'd say that, but I don't think the father is a coward. He's an older guy. He's a surgeon. Now, I don't know if in Spain they have the Hippocratic Oath, but I assume that they do, where you take the oath as a medical person that you don't harm people. And although, of course, there are medical people who have gone against that, murderers, etc., generally speaking, it's something that they do take seriously, of course. And since this movie is trying to be realistic, he does take it seriously. And I believe he also knows that he's an older guy. Sure, he can run with his son, but he even struggles with that. And it's not just about being physically capable of doing something. If you've spent your entire life saving people, as he has, how can you then just suddenly turn around and kill a child? Which is what they are. I like the fact that that is given weight, and he has that weight of responsibility. He doesn't take it lightly, and neither does the filmmaker. And I think that was a brilliant choice. He's not a coward, as far as I'm concerned. He takes taking life very, very seriously. So when he does finally do it and kills that kid in the bathroom, it means more. And all of the moments when he makes these bad decisions, hitting the kid on his bike, stealing the phone, and easily the most infuriating moment in the entire movie, when he takes that phone into the police station and that inspector won't even look at it because of the technicality of law. That was a brilliant scene, because in that scene, I hated that character. I would have smashed her head into the table if that was my son. I don't care if there's police around. I would have jammed that phone so far into her skull that she wouldn't have needed to press play. That is the kind of emotion that the movie gave me watching it. And I'm sure that's not the same for everyone. But the fact that the movie can give you that to me says a lot about the filmmaking. And it has that consistently through the movie, how the school kids are every bit as bratty as real school kids are. It's nice to know that it's not just kids in the UK that are like that, because they really are. Just waste of space. They really are. I can't believe I was ever a kid, and I'm glad to say I wasn't like that, because I would have been aware of it, because my dad would have told me. But no, in this flick, every single character is like they're just an oppression in the guy's life. And then that ending. We've got to talk about the ending. That ending. When a father's love goes too far. I find it interestingly similar to Joker. Think about it. Think about how similar this movie actually is to Joker. It is, isn't it? It's allowed to play out. A downtrodden character who has gifts, but doesn't necessarily have the confidence to use them. And then he's finally pushed to the breaking point by something which is technically true. His son is exposed, but he still can't accept it. Joker is exposed in that interview with Murray, and he cannot accept it. It's a very similar movie to Joker. And the ending is so perfectly dark and bleak that it almost makes you feel for a split second that the movie was pointless. But at the same time, I couldn't feel that way because I understand the father. And that's a crucial thing about filmmaking. Understanding a character and appreciating a character's arc and story doesn't mean you agree with them. You're not supposed to agree with Joker. I don't recall the guy's name, and I know I'll get skewered for it, but the guy who wrote The Godfather, he hated how audience reacted to The Godfather Part 2. Because people liked Michael Corleone. He's a villain. He wrote him to be despised, and people loved him. People love Joker. Joker is not a good guy. People idolize the Joker-Harley relationship. It's one of the most abusive relationships out there. And yet people revere it. Likewise with this movie, it reminds you that no, this is a guy. He's not perfect. And his love for his son went too far. Deleting evidence. I was right. I was still with him. Right up until he pushed the girl out of his house. Because a brat or not, she was attacked. I'm not going to say it because of the YouTube algorithm, but you know what I'm talking about. She was a victim, brat or otherwise. Nothing excuses that. You could almost make a sequel to this movie about her father getting revenge. And I think that would be an amazing sequel. But I could still have given him another chance. Even after that, when he goes to visit his son at the end, I thought he was going to do the quote-unquote right thing. Maybe not even the right thing, just something. The way the camera lingered on his son's air tube, I thought that he was just going to unscrew it. I would have loved that ending. Does what the son did make him worthy of death? Arguable. Would that have been an interesting ending? Most definitely. Because you're already conflicted about the father, especially at that point in the film. But at least that would have been some kind of finalization to the movie. Whereas the way things are, so many aspects of the story are still left up in the air. What's going to happen to that girl? Is she going to stay quiet, or is she going to tell her father? What's going to happen to his own family? He killed a kid in the bathroom. Somebody will have found that kid. So what's going to happen with that? He's on CCTV. He's already ruined his own life. His son may never come out of that coma anyway, so you could have even viewed it as a mercy by killing him. He deletes the evidence, thereby not only protecting his son, but condoning it. That's what he did, even if he didn't know that that's what it meant. There are so many loose ends that are so perfectly left undone, and usually that would really annoy me in a film, but for this one, it just felt so perfect. And this is the kind of movie where the more I think about it, the more time passes, and crucially, the more I talk about it, the more I actually realize how excellent a film it is. Some people really won't agree with that. Some people will probably despise this movie, and I could understand that. I would say that compared to this, The Fury of a Patient Man seems like a popcorn flick, and I love it for that. Overall, I like The Fury of a Patient Man more in terms of rewatchability. It is more beautiful, it has that catharsis to some degree, and the violence is even more intense. This one really did remind me much more of Blue Ruin, and I'm going to review Blue Ruin on the channel as well. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on Joker. Do you think my comparison holds water? I certainly do. But yeah, tell me your thoughts. What did you think of the ending? What did you think of the scenes that I mentioned? Those long, awkward, drawn-out shots. But until next time, I'll see you then. So of course, stick around on the channel for more reviews. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.